And as we noted, Bill Finger wrote over 1,500 Batman stories, but he's far from the only Golden Age writer to write Batman. In fact, while Bill Finger did write Batman's second story in Detective Comics number 28, the next 7 stories were written by someone else. So issues 29 through 35, with the exceptions of 2 pages, were written by a man named Gardner Fox. So who's Gardner Fox? So he was a writer, another Brooklyn native who was born in 1911. He studied law at St. John's College and joined the New York bar and practiced law for a few years. By all accounts, he enjoyed being a lawyer, but it coincided with the Great Depression, and so there wasn't a ton of financial downside to leaving and becoming a writer, which he enjoyed more. And much like Bill Finger was recruited to become a comics writer by Bob Kane, despite not having any real professional history, Fox was recruited by his friend since elementary school, Vince Sullivan. At the time, he was writing fill-in stories, and a fill-in is kind of what it sounds like. It's a story that's made by a different creative team that keeps a book on schedule. So, for example, like if you and I, Brian, are writing, Superman, we write 1, 2, 3 to come out in like June, July, August, but we're behind on the September book. We would use a fill-in issue to do September, and then we'd be back in October.
Doing a podcast, like the idea of fill-ins is kind of nice.
Yes.
And like keeping your schedule and whatnot. But I was also thinking about just like shows that I've liked in the past and how common something like a fill-in is, and you've got different directors for different episodes.
Sure.
So like with the X-Files, Supernatural, those are like really famous, maybe even notorious for some people for having like that big overarching storyline that is not referenced in every single episode. They've got rando tangent episodes all over the place, and so it seems like those are like good types of fill-in episodes in like a modern kind of angle.
And modern comics do this too. Like it is not unusual for like people talk about runs. There will be either a writer or writer artist combo that is in charge of a book at a given point in time. Like we just finished the Nick Spencer run on Spider-Man, right? And he'll write issue, 68, 67, 66, 65, 64, but like maybe 63, they weren't ready. And so someone else wrote that issue, right? It happens all the time.
Yeah. And so like we watch a lot of crime stuff. So it's like NCIS, CSI, Criminal Minds, like all those types of shows. And they all have those fill-in type things.
They just pad it out.
Yeah, they like do an episode where like this has nothing to do with the whatever killer that they're after for the season, but like they still have cases to solve and whatnot.
So he was doing fill-ins for Speed Saunders, which was another story that ran monthly in Detective Comics alongside Batman, Cotton Carver, which ran in Adventure Comics. But Bill Finger had only written 2 stories. And Fox is only a fill-in writer for other recurring comics. But despite all that fact, Gardner Fox starts writing Batman full-time in Detective Comics. So there's some conflicting characterizations of exactly how this went, so we don't exactly know why. In Jim Stranko's History of Comics, the story goes that Whitney Ellsworth, who was an associate editor at the time underneath Vince Sullivan, quote, takes Finger off of Batman. It doesn't go into any reason, just says that Ellsworth is the one making the call and that it's explicitly about taking Finger off the book. History of Comics it's kind of like this. It's one of the earlier comic book history books, and because it was written in 1970, we know it was compiled from lots of interviews with creators that were actually there in the Golden Age, so it's very well regarded, but it covers a ton. So it doesn't go into a whole lot of detail. I've also been reading a much more recent book from 2021 called The Creators of Batman by an author named Rick Worth. And I'm really appreciating this book because it covers a lot of the early years after Detective number 27 with a focus on creators. So either you get books like The History of Batman that's more focused on the story, or you have like Bill the Boy Wonder that's like very much about the first Batman story. This is one that covers the period right after, which I really like.
Cool.
At some point, I'd love to have Rick on the show to talk about it, but his accounting of events doesn't mention Ellsworth at all, which makes sense to me because Gardner Fox was Vince Sullivan's friend, the editor-in-chief. So why an associate editor is involved, I'm not really sure. But the book goes on to say that it's not super clear why Fox is swapped in, whether it's that his writing is preferred or, maybe Bill Finger is having trouble keeping up with the schedule. It is 7 issues right in a row, so it's not just like a fill-in here or there. My intuition is that it actually probably does have a lot to do with scheduling. Bill Finger is notorious for not hitting deadlines. It's something that a lot of people talk about in interviews with him. And even as Fox is writing Batman stories through issue 35, he shares issue 33, Bill Finger. So that's that 2 pages that we were talking about earlier. And that 2-page story is a pretty important one. So I think it implies that they still trust Bill Finger with the character. And you have to remember that Finger is writing other strips for Kane at the time, including Rusty and His Pals, which is another story that's running in Adventure Comics. And we know off the bat that Batman's a success, but it's not, Batman isn't what we think it is today. So it's not this great offense that like he's not writing the second story or the third story or whatever. Whatever the reason, Finger is never on record as being upset that Fox has taken over Batman. If anything, Finger has a really high level of regard for Gardner Fox. Bill Finger is an avid reader. That's one of the things that comes up over and over and over again when people talk about him in books, is that he loves fiction. And Fox is a great writer, a very successful writer. He writes like over 150 novels, very successful in pulp magazines. And we know that Finger loved pulps. So, has an appreciation for Fox. He takes over and he only writes 7 stories, and he doesn't write another Batman story until 1964, right? So 1939, 1940, he writes a few issues and then is out of the picture for many years to come.
For 20 years?
Yeah, that's right. He comes back to the character in 1964. Long time. Yes, it is.
Wow.
But even having only written these 7 stories, he introduces some really important tropes for the character, which I won't spoil now, but we're going to read a story that he wrote in just a minute, and we're going to get to learn about some of the things that he brought to Batman. It's not really important to the history we're talking about today, but I do feel obligated to let you know, like people are going to be really mad at me if I don't, that after these 7 stories, Fox goes on to create tons of stuff that you know. He's the creator of The Flash, of Hawkman, Dr. Fate, Zatanna, DC's Sandman, and the Justice Society of America. And Justice Society is like the first team book, right? So like the Avengers don't exist without Justice Society, and the MCU ostensibly. He also writes a really important. Then. Yeah, he writes a really important issue of The Flash called The Flash of Two Worlds, which is kind of like the first multiverse book. So kind of a big deal for the DC universe.
So can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
That you may not know the answer to?
Sure.
What came first, Superman moving super fast or The Flash?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, because I'm thinking to like the influence of stuff, and like coming up with The Flash cold is really impressive,
Yeah.
Riffing off of and like peeling back powers from Superman to make spin-off characters is like not that impressive,
So Superman at first, it's worth noting, is not as powerful as he becomes later. Superman is primarily
he couldn't
inspired...
fly and stuff, right? He literally leaped buildings.
Right. One of his major inspirations was John Carter of Mars, and John Carter of Mars' whole thing is that he's from Mars where the gravity is stronger, so he's just a stronger person and can jump higher and all that kind of stuff. Right. It comes, And so that's kind of where they're riffing with Superman. And if you watch like the Fleischer cartoons that were from the 30s, his big thing is he leaps tall buildings in a single bound, right? And he's faster than a speeding locomotive.
Right.
But that's not like running around the earth in a second.
Right.
And that's not flying, right? Like he can run 70 miles an hour. Is that faster than the Flash? I don't know. This is a good question. We'll have to maybe loop back on that in a future episode. I do, I want to keep the show mostly focused on Batman, but I think it would be worth doing as we step through the ages to maybe do an episode about what's going on in the rest of the DC universe. Because it's going to cross over a lot.
I'm only asking the question to give more credibility to Fox, to Gardner Fox in his creative,
Yeah, people talk about Gardner Fox even now, and they don't necessarily talk about his originality. One of the things, although I think, the proof is in the pudding that he was, one of the things that they really talk about, one of the reasons he's celebrated these days is he's particularly socially conscious. He has, views and themes in his book that are ahead of the time, let's say, in terms of racial equality and gender equality and things like that.